Please, we are about to begin the program. Diplomats, guests, colleagues, students, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of Jindal Center for Israel Studies at the Jindal School of International Affairs, OP Jindal Global University, it is indeed a great pleasure for me to welcome you all to the first joint international conference with Tel Aviv University on India-Israel academic dialogues, political and cultural crossings. Jindal Center for Israel Studies has been promoting the study of modern Israel in India since 2012. It was only natural for us to take this opportunity to celebrate the 25 years of diplomatic relations between India and Israel, to review the delicate bonhomie between the two nations, to engage in a cross-cultural dialogue between Indian and Israeli academics. The two-day conference promises intellectual discussions that will definitely be geopolitically charged and culturally nuanced. It will give us an opportunity to draw comparative parallels between the two very complex societies. Country-based regional studies are not new within academia. Many universities in the world have established Chinese studies, German studies, and centers that study modern India, for example. Israel studies straddles many fields: Jewish, Middle Eastern, history, ethnopolitics, language, religion, and culture. It is multidisciplinary and it is thematic, that offers multiple narratives that are situated in specific cultural contexts. And this makes intellectual engagement rigorous and indeed very, very dynamic. Due to the international nature of the curriculum, since its inception, the Jindal Center for Israel Studies, besides Indian students, have had students from Afghanistan, Mozambique, Kenya, South Africa, and the United States. Jindal Center for Israel Studies aspires to pioneer the field of Israel studies in India through excellence in teaching for multicultural non-Western classrooms, and aims to build research colloquium in Israeli history, politics, society, culture, Israel-diaspora relations, and is committed towards advancing knowledge of India-Israel bilateral engagement. We are thankful to our sponsor, Middle East Forum US, and the encouraging support of Professor Daniel Pipes, President, Middle East Forum. We are also very grateful to Professor Ranan Ryan, Vice President, Tel Aviv University, and the entire delegation from Tel Aviv University for their eagerness to engage with us today. The Embassy of Israel in India has been a positive support in shaping various joint seminars and cultural events. For that, I wish to thank Ambassador Daniel Carmen, Ms. Ditsa Foim, Minister Counselor, Head of Public Diplomacy, Embassy of Israel in India. Also, I wish to acknowledge contributions of Israeli diplomats formerly in India, Tanya Berg-Rafeli, Hannah Anchi, and Shimon Mosa Wood. Dr. Shashi Tharoor, Jindal School of International Affairs at OP Jindal University, is indebted for your kind and generous friendship. Last but not the least, I wish to acknowledge the inspiring leadership of Professor Lantro in Brandeis University for making a very productive and rather exhausting summer at the Schusterman Center for Israel Studies Summer Institute into a fascinating academic journey for both me, who am convener of the Jindal Center for Israel Studies, and Dr. Kivra Jamgwed, who's the academic coordinator. We have a distinguished inaugural panel this morning. To offer their remarks, I shall briefly introduce each speaker as I invite them to the podium. Our first speaker today is Ambassador Daniel Carmen, Ambassador of Israel in India. He served as a paratrooper in the Israel Defense Forces, where he attained the rank of lieutenant. He has previously worked with Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Embassy Attaché in Washington, D.C. From 2011 to 2014, he served as Deputy Director General, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and head of Mashav, Israel's Agency for International Development Cooperation. Additionally, in 2014, Ambassador Carmen was appointed as Ambassador of Israel to India and the non-resident ambassador to Sri Lanka. May I now invite Ambassador Daniel Carmen to say a few words.
Thank you, Rohi, for this introduction. I'm delighted to be here with you this morning. I'm delighted to see on the folder a saying, Hachug lelimudei Israel, Jindal, the Jindal Center for Israeli Studies. It's really a delight and honor, and I'm very, very excited. As part of my career as a diplomat, I also had the privilege to serve at the United Nations, and I had the honor to be partnering and to get the good guidance of Shashi as a UN official, high-level UN official, Under-Secretary General at the time, where he was very much interested in our issues, and as a matter of fact, very helpful and very instrumental in helping in one of Israel's first proactive, when Israel dared to do an initiative at the United Nations which had to do with anti-Semitism and Holocaust remembrance. So this presence of yours, Shashi, here this morning is very significant, and I thank you very much for this. Professor Ryan, we talk a lot, and last night we sort of summed up the wonderful work of Tel Aviv University in this country, in this huge country, really unbelievable, unprecedented, and I want to thank you not only for being here and being a partner in this morning and in those 2 days, but also in this contribution to the very important India-Israel relationship. Ladies and gentlemen, first may I begin by thanking both Jindal University and Tel Aviv University for organizing this important event today. Events such as these, taking place naturally between the people of India and the people of Israel, are the very foundation for sustainable relations between our nations. We, at the Embassy of Israel, are proud guests here today, witnesses of the growing bonds between people, between minds, between hearts. I would also like to applaud Jindal University for establishing the first Center for Israeli Studies in India, Hachug Lelimudei Israel. For this, I specifically commend Vice Chancellor Raj Kumar, Dr. Hinvarj Janjid, and Dr. Roy Dasgupta, whom I'm told is the heart and the engine behind this program. Thank you very much. Let us hope that this first center will be a model to many more centers to come all over India. Earlier this week, I stressed in an interview to the press that India and Israel need to know more about each other. I definitely stand behind this statement as a very important and basic statement, and believe that what we are doing here today is one of the means to that end. Knowing one another means knowing each other's history, heritage, culture, present. It means understanding each other's values, interests, and challenges. And in this respect, we are already halfway there, as we have long stated that India and Israel have shared values, shared interests, and shared challenges, which are already working together to overcome with shared solutions. But we have a long way to go. Knowing one another helps to the depth and sustainability of the relations. Knowing one another also means knowing the full nature of our friendship. As we celebrate 25 years of growing partnership, and this event is definitely one ingredient in this celebration, Indian and Israeli representatives alike are stressing the multifaceted relations between our countries. From security to food security, from education to innovation, from water to outer space, those are real areas of concern and real areas of activity. Israel has been and is being tried and tested as India's technological partner. India has been and is being tried and tested for the partnership and the friendship to Israel as well. The joint endeavor by these two countries and these two outstanding universities is an example of the deepening and widening relations between us. Together, young minds, guided, experienced minds will strive not only for academic excellence, but for a greater awareness of our commonalities and the lessons we can learn from our differences. This merging of minds enriches every party involved, Indian and Israeli alike. And may I dare say, for our own sake, both countries' sake, institutions, governments, people, but also for the sake and for the benefit of the entire world. I wish you all the best of luck and interest both in the following 2 days and for the rest of the cooperation between the universities and the joint programs you have built. I sincerely hope more will join you and follow your footsteps to ensure the Indo-Israeli bond remains sustainable and strong and irreversible. Thank you very much.
Very encouraging words. Our next speaker is Professor Ranan Ryan from Tel Aviv University, who's the Vice President. He's the Elias Rasky Professor of Latin American and Spanish History and Vice President of Tel Aviv University. He's also the head of S. Daniel Abraham Center for International and Regional Studies. Professor Ryan is the author and editor of more than 30 books and well over 100 articles in academic journals and book chapters in several languages. He is a member of Argentina's National Academy of History and former president of the Latin American Jewish Studies Association. His research interests lie in modern Latin America, populist movements, Argentine society and politics, Jews in Spanish-speaking world, ethnic minorities in Latin America, immigration, collective identity, and 20th century Spain. May I now request Professor Ranan Ryan to present his inaugural remarks.
Rohi, Shalom, Namaste, good morning. I take great pleasure in welcoming you all to this joint conference of OP Jindal University and Tel Aviv University. It's truly a great pleasure for me, for us, the faculty members of Tel Aviv University, to be here today. As the two previous speakers have mentioned, Israel and India are marking this year the 25th anniversary of the establishment of full-fledged diplomatic relations between the two countries. And it seems that we are somehow trying to compensate for lost time. And if in the 1990s the ties between the two countries were unidimensional in a way and focused mostly on military and security issues, by now, fortunately, the two countries are collaborating in a wide variety of areas and focus on military, security, but at the same time, culture, academia, economics, etc., etc. Indeed, this is very, very impressive. India and Israel are very different in very many ways, but India and Israel have some similarities as well. I truly believe that we share certain values. In a way, we face several similar challenges on the national and regional level as well. The two countries have to deal with the fact that they are multi-ethnic, multicultural, multi-religious in many ways. And therefore, this is a strong basis for collaboration in academic affairs. Tel Aviv University has been leader as far as the collaboration between us and a wide variety of Indian universities and research institutes. Traditionally speaking, most of the research ties of Tel Aviv University have been with either North American universities or European ones. However, about 9 or 10 years ago, we took a strategic decision, and India became very high on our priority. Tel Aviv University established the so-called India-Israel Forum, which meets annually and brings together leading decision makers, leading public figures, people from the industry, and academics. And in a way, through this India-Israel Forum, we've been able to establish ties with both universities here and industry. And nowadays, this tie between academia and industry is crucial for the development of our countries, for the success of universities. Tel Aviv University is the largest and most comprehensive university in Israel. It's a leading research institution of an interdisciplinary character. It very much emphasizes innovation and entrepreneurship, and it is a global university. OP Jindal is a global university, but we are also a global university. We have the largest number of international, in Israel, the largest number of international research collaborations, the largest number of international students, postdoctoral fellows, visiting professors coming to Tel Aviv University. And by now we have a kind of web of ties with Indian universities in different parts of this country. We have joint degree programs, we have joint research projects, we have students coming to Tel Aviv University and professors of Tel Aviv University coming to teach here in various areas. At least here at Jindal University, I think that only last month, Professor Orit Rosin, one of our faculty members, came to teach a seminar. This very week, Professor Yair Be'eri from our Faculty of Engineering is teaching in Coimbatore at KCT, and we've had other professors coming to teach here. Relatively speaking, the number of Indian students in Israel in general and in Tel Aviv University as well is still small. But the numbers are growing, and joint efforts both at the governmental level and at the university level are already paying off. As I said earlier in my conversation with the Israeli ambassador, Ambassador Carmon, 5 years ago, in 2012, Tel Aviv University had only 2 postdoctoral fellows from India. This year, we have 65 of them. Going from 2 to 65 in 5 years, this is a major change, and Indian presence by now is very much felt on our campus in Tel Aviv. But apart from being a leading research institution, a hub for new startups, I always say that if indeed Israel is the startup nation, then the city of Tel Aviv is the capital city of this country, and Tel Aviv University is one of the dynamos or motors behind this amazing development taking place in Israel. But Tel Aviv University also represents an important actor in the kind of cultural war that we are having to deal with in Israel. The core values of Tel Aviv University have to do with pluralism, with tolerance, and with solidarity. And I look at the title that Rohi and her team put for this joint conference. It says dialogues. And I think indeed that our mission as universities is to try and build bridges. Politicians might want to try and build walls, but our mission is to build bridges. I would like to acknowledge and express my gratitude to our partners at Jindal University, Dr. Rohi, Dr. Kinvraj, their team have done a superb job in preparing this conference, which I hope would become an annual event. I do hope that it's not a one-time episode, but the beginning of a series. I've always been in favor of inventing traditions, so let's invent a tradition here and now of the annual joint conference of OP Jindal and Tel Aviv University. So thank you so much to the team of OP Jindal, to the Israeli Embassy, Ambassador Carmon, and Ms. Ditza for thank you so much for the other partners in this event, the Middle East Forum. I probably forget some of the people that I need to thank, but first and foremost, thank you all for taking part in this fascinating intellectual endeavor, and I wish us all good luck. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Ryan. Inspiring words and more work for the future indeed. Thank you. It's an honor to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Shashi Tharoor, who is an author, politician, former international civil servant, and a man with several worlds of experience. Currently a second-term Lok Sabha member of Parliament representing Thiruvananthapuram constituency and chairman of the Parliamentary Standing Committee on External Affairs. He has previously served as Minister of State for Human Resource Development and Minister of State for External Affairs in the Government of India. During his nearly 3-decade-long prior career at United Nations, he served as a peacekeeper, refugee worker, administrator at the highest levels, serving as Under-Secretary General during Kofi Annan's leadership of the organization. Dr. Tharoor is also an award-winning author of 16 books of both fiction as well as non-fiction. He was awarded an honorary DLit from University of Puget Sound, a doctorate honoris causa in history by University of Bucharest. He is also recipient of several awards that include Commonwealth Writers' Prize, the Pravasi Bharatiya Samman, India's highest honor for overseas nationals. In 2012, the King of Spain awarded him the Encomienda de la Real Order Española de Carlos III. May I now request Dr. Tharoor to give his inaugural comments. Dr. Shashi Tharoor.
I did earn my PhD the hard way first, as the rest of you did. The honorary ones came later, but I see that's been left out of the...
We know that.
That's been left out of the summarized bio. But anyway, Ambassador Daniel Carmon, Professor Ranan Ryan, Dr. Rohit Das Gupta, distinguished delegates and participants of this conference, ladies and gentlemen, friends. It is a pleasure to be here, though I must admit I've got to the point where I'm doing so many events for the Jindal School that I don't know what to do with my collection of all those scarves. You're going to have to think of new ways to thank me for being here. Extra cup of tea or something we'll have to do, I guess. But it is a joy to be here for all sorts of reasons. As I said to Ambassador Carmon when I saw him on entering this morning, his presence was a powerful incentive for me to accept yet another invitation from Jindal. I'm already hosting Jindal Stanford students tonight. So doing one before, one for dinner and one just after breakfast is perhaps excessive friendship to your absent Vice Chancellor, Raj Kumar, who I first met as a Harvard student and who remains a close friend. But I do want to say, however, that Danny Carmon and I go back a very long way, and it gave me an absolute delight when he was named Israel's ambassador to India. I knew that the relationship was in very good hands, but equally to me it was a sign that Israel valued this relationship because they sent us one of their best. And what is more, as Danny said, we actually had a lot to do with each other during my stewardship of the Department of Public Information and his yeoman service, both in the permanent mission of Israel to the United Nations and in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He visited me in that capacity also. And I gave him rather freely of my advice on occasion, some of which he actually took, which I'm very gratified by. And one of my points, Danny, which I will remind you of because I'm going to come back to it later in my few brief keynote remarks. One of my points you may remember, though it's now, 17 years ago or whatever, was expand the conversation. Do not let others define what you are about, what you stand for, and where you get pigeonholed in their view of things. So I persuaded Danny that instead of every Israeli intervention in the Fourth Political Committee, which dealt with public information, being confined to issues of the Middle East and Palestine and so on and so forth, that Israel should actually surprise everybody by delivering a speech on everything else. Talk about public information, talk about strategic communications, talk about sustainable development, talk about the role of the United Nations in today's world. And I can't tell you the impact that speech had when Israel did deliver it. It really had a, so I take some pride and satisfaction in having contributed to that. But more important, it is also true that I did insist upon hosting and chairing the very first ever seminar on anti-Semitism under the UN's roof. And I also insisted on inviting a number of trenchant critics of the United Nations, including several from the Jewish community and some rather outspoken Jewish NGOs, who said things about the United Nations under the United Nations roof that some people have still not forgiven me for 2 decades later, but which I felt was necessary to vent a lot of the pressure that had built up between the United Nations and Israel. And once that had happened, once we actually found a situation in which dialogue was possible, you get the grievances off your chest, and then you talk frankly as friends. And I think that led, amongst other things, to a number of other positive developments. Things I could do under my own department included a major exhibition on the Holocaust in the United Nations, and then the General Assembly passed a resolution agreeing to commemorate the Holocaust. Was it the 60th anniversary or the 50th of the liberation of the camps? 60th, I guess, yeah, 60th. And I was given the great honor of being the compere or master of ceremonies of that entire commemoration, which is one of my more memorable half days at the UN. So we have a lot of memories we shared. In that rather exciting stint I had at the UN, but also that rather important period when Israel found its acceptance and its role of the world body changing, I would say truthfully, beyond recognition. And Danny Carmon was present at the creation, to use Dean Acheson's famous phrase. And I think that gives us a very sound foundation for the equally, if not even more transformative phase that India-Israel relations are going through today. Professor Ryan, I'm delighted to hear his opening remarks. When I looked at his bio and we heard him being introduced as a Latin Americanist, I couldn't resist asking him mischievously whether, like Columbus, he had lost his way, but in the other direction. But in some ways, of course, many Latin Americans like to tell us that India reminds them very much of their own continent. And I think perhaps we might find an interesting academic work coming out of Professor Ryan's visits here, which will compare and contrast the experiences of the two countries. Certainly when you read a book like Octavio Paz's Labyrinth of Solitude, you are constantly struck by the extent of parallels with India, and of course the fascination that Paz had for India. His Monkey Grammarian remains one of the more delightful books. His In Light of India was his very last published work before he passed away. There are affinities there that I would argue that India has not adequately explored. And finally, in these preliminary remarks, my congratulations to the Jindal Global University. I'm proud to say that I had served as a bit of a mentor to Professor Rajkumar when he first dreamt up the idea of this university. I was one of the handful of people he consulted and sought advice from. But I have to confess, I could never have imagined what has become of the university in the few brilliant years of its existence. Its success, its reputation, its expansion, the establishment of a number of different faculties and schools, and now the establishment of the first ever, and so far the first and only, Center for Israel Studies in India, I think is testament both to Jindal University's constant, continuing ambition to break new ground and chart new paths in our country's academic world, but also I think its willingness to entertain new ideas and new fields of international inquiry. And this partnership with Tel Aviv University, which Professor Ryan has just told us might culminate in an annual conference, suggests to me that this has already got off to a wonderful start. So once again, Dr. Dasgupta, congratulations to you, and through you to your senior colleagues in the decision-making business of these things. This is a wonderful initiative and one well worth doing. Now, I don't want to say a great deal in these keynote remarks simply because you have such an excellently thought out program and so many highly competent and qualified scholars, practitioners, journalists, commentators who are going to address in detail every aspect of it, that it would probably be superfluous for me to go into a superficial rendition of things that you're going to hear about in greater depth. But I'll confine myself to a few broad general observations, knowing full well that every sentence I speak can be amplified, enriched, and possibly contradicted by people who have spent far more time studying everything that I'm going to say. But broadly speaking, there are a few thoughts, probably not even half a dozen, I didn't count them before thinking through them, that I would dangle before you to sort of set some of the groundwork in this inaugural session for the remaining excellent panels lying ahead. The first is the very, very deep historical roots of this relationship. I come from Kerala, where, as you know, oral legend says that we have the oldest Jewish community outside today's Israel, and that is that we believe that when the Romans destroyed the first temple, I beg your pardon, the Babylonians destroyed the first temple in the 6th century BC, that Jews crossed over into Kerala. Certainly there is much more evidence and certainly a lot of oral legend surrounding the diaspora that came after the destruction of the second temple a few centuries later. Because there, Kerala is full of these stories, and it is said in the Christian community, for example, that when St. Thomas the Apostle, doubting Thomas of the Bible, landed on the shores of Kerala somewhere around 52 AD, that he was welcomed on shore by a flute-playing Jewish girl. I love that little extra touch, the flute-playing Jewish girl. So that means the community had been around a rather long time, and so for us, that's a given. But equally strikingly, as you know, that diaspora and the two other Jewish diasporas in India, that is the Bene Israel community, which came God knows when, maybe around the same time, no one will ever know. They were discovered by a wandering Jewish rabbi sometime in the 11th century, but they'd been around for hundreds of years before that, and had been treated by the locals as another subcaste, with peculiar habits and this and sort of this fondness for a star. But nonetheless, the rabbi said, when he spent time with them and realized who they were, that they were actually Jewish, and he sort of made them a little more self-aware. And that community is, of course, the most numerous, both here and in Israel. I think in Israel about 25,000 families trace their origins to the Ben Israel community. And the third community, which we call the Baghdadi Jews, but actually came from every Ottoman capital, really, seeking a better life, greater security, and more prosperity under the British Raj, they came mainly to the metropolitan areas of India. So you have these three distinct diasporas, and I'm not even getting into the controversy about the Menashe, but that I'm not touching that. But whether they came or were born or saw the light, that's for all of the theologians to sort out. But these three diasporas can truthfully say that they remain, and India remains the one country in which the Jews knew no persecution, no anti-Semitism throughout their entire existence as a diaspora from the local people. And that there is no parallel for anywhere else in the world. And in fact, what's striking is that the only instance of persecution of Jews on Indian soil came not from Indians, but from the Portuguese who showed up in the 16th century and started harassing the Jews, which is why they fled from Cranganore to Kochi, where they were given immediately refuge, land, and so on, and built one of the greatest mosques in Judaism, which if any of you in this room haven't seen, I would commend to you extremely warmly. It was built, completed about 1565. I've seen it. It's got exquisite mosaics, imported mainly from China at that time, and extraordinary work, and lots of other beautiful things. But it is one of the most wonderfully attractive buildings, certainly in Kerala, and arguably amongst the synagogues I visited, it will hold its place with any. So this ancient history is worth talking about, even if the numbers have dwindled to such a great extent that, for example, in Kochi's rather tactlessly named Jewtown, you can't assemble a minyan. And I gather that tourists and an occasional imported rabbi from Sydney have to make up the numbers when an occasion demands it. But the fact is that it is still a history that we have every reason, I think, on both sides of the relationship to be rather proud of. The second thought that I would dangle before you is that though indeed we are right to be celebrating the 25th anniversary of the establishment of full diplomatic relations and the establishment of embassies in 1992, it is also true that India was amongst the first countries to recognize the State of Israel when it was created, and that in 1950 consulates were established. So there is a longer relationship. One could argue that that's not good enough, and I don't disagree with those Israelis who feel that way. But I think you're doing a slight disservice to the extraordinary amount of affinity that the leaders of the Israeli Labour Party, who of course were the leaders of Israel in those days, and the leaders of India's Congress Party, who were leading India in the same period, felt for each other in the 1950s. It is said that Ben Gurion's relationship with Nehru is something that requires serious academic research. They did meet, they have spoken, they have exchanged thoughts and ideas. A lot of it was done discreetly, and that brings me to my third point, for a very important reason that I think Israelis have had no illusions about, and that is India's domestic politics. India certainly had, throughout the nationalist movement and later, and a very, very great consciousness of its responsibility to its Muslim minority. I think Professor Krishnaswamy is just telling me he's writing and finishing a book on Gandhiji's view of the idea of the Jewish national home. And we all know, I've quoted a passage from Gandhiji in my book, Pax Indica, in discussing the India-Israel relationship, in which he says that, I have great sympathy for the Jewish people, but this is not the way to solve it, because Palestine is the homeland of the Arabs as much as Germany is that of the Germans and England is that of the English. That was his view. And because of that view, there was never any sympathy for the establishment of Israel, just as there was no sympathy for the parallel demand for the establishment of a Muslim homeland in India for what became later the state of Pakistan. And the arguments were seen by many in the nationalist movement as comparable to each other. That is, that people of a particular religious group, instead of merely saying we can live together with people of other groups, were insisting on creating a different state for themselves. Now, obviously, there were very different histories at play, and I think Professor Krishnaswamy is probably going to argue that the Indian nationalists did not fully appreciate the differences between the history of the Jewish people over the preceding 2,000 years and the history of Hindu-Muslim relations in the subcontinent over the preceding few hundred years. But the fact is that whether they understood it or not, they approached the issue through the same prism. And this explains partly the origins of India's somewhat diffident policy towards Israel after independence. I should stress that the consulates were not inactive consulates. There was work going on. There was tremendous cooperation in agriculture and particularly desert farming, where the way in which Israel made the deserts bloom and the kibbutz was widely reported. I grew up in India and read extensively in the Indian media about the achievements of Israel, and with sympathy. So it's not as if it was some sort of unrelieved hostility at all. There was a diffidence rather than a hostility, and I think it's important that my Israeli friends appreciate the difference, because there may have been a willingness for some people in my country to portray this period in rather black and white terms, and I think that would do injustice to the complexity of the manner in which that relationship was in fact conducted. But certainly there was a qualitative change after 1992, and there is no doubt that the advent of terrorism became a major cementing factor in this relationship, because the terrorism took the form of Islamist, I use the word carefully, terrorism in both places. In other words, what had started off initially as a tactic of the Palestinians as a people took on an explicitly Islamist coloration, with some of the other entrants and variants in the terrorist cause. And in India, similarly, what had begun as Kashmiris claiming greater autonomy, maybe some arguing for independence and so on, took on an explicitly Islamist coloration with the the flourishing of groups like the Lashkar-e-Toiba, the Jaish-e-Mohammed and others that drew their inspiration much more from what they described as the tenets of radical Islam rather than, or radical interpretations of Islam, rather than any sort of purely quote-unquote national cause. And so the sense that we were facing similar threats from similar sources, and please, if any of you is recording this, quote my words accurately, because I'm choosing my words carefully. This, I think, certainly contributed significantly to the growing closeness, the enhanced defense cooperation, and the increasing intensification of cooperation in areas like counterterrorism and intelligence sharing, as well as the sale of weapon systems from Israel to India, of which the most famous example is the Falcon airborne early warning aircraft system. There's no question that that itself points to an extra element in the relationship, which is the very useful role played by the United States in contributing to this closeness. I'll give you two examples. I mean, in the days, or in the bad old days, some of you might say before 91, a favorite phrase many of us at the UN used to use jokingly was one we always heard from Soviet diplomats who would say, "It is no accident, comrades." This was a very favorite way for academics of that particular side to express their point of view. And it is no accident, comrades, that the closeness with Israel began in 1992 as part of an overall reorientation of Indian foreign policy thinking at the end of the Cold War, which included a complete revisioning of India's geopolitical postures and its orientation to the world, manifested, of course, principally in a changed attitude and relationship to the United States, but also in a number of others, such as the Look East policy towards Southeast Asia and ASEAN. And Israel, I think, would not deny that there would have been some encouragement from Washington for India to move in the direction it did. Just as, to give you the other example, I mentioned the Falcon. What many of you, I'm sure, already know is that Israel first tried to sell the Falcon to China. And because it was developed with joint technology by the US had a veto on the sale, and the US exercised their veto, which it is estimated cost the Israelis a pretty penny. But when Israel went to the US and said, okay, we want to sell it to India, the US said, fine, go right ahead. And so that, there's always in Indian village marriages a very important role played by the local barber, the nai. The US, I think, to some degree has been the nai in this relationship as well. And I say this obviously slightly exaggeratedly and slightly tongue-in-cheek, but the truth is that that third angle should also be borne in mind. There is a larger set of issues at stake, and you'll see how often India-Israel sentiment has been expressed on US soil. Brajesh Mishra's famous speech took place in Washington. The role played by the American Jewish organizations in encouraging closeness between India and Israel is striking. And the affinity between American Jewish organizations and Indian American organizations. I mean, all of these, there's a rich area of work for a future MPhil scholar or whatever in your Israel Institute, because I think that this is an underappreciated and underexplored area of supportive pillar, as it were, for the relationship. But to come back to where I began, where I said to Danny that we need to also not allow Israel and India to be stereotyped in very narrow terms, just as I said that about Israel and the UN, I would say that let us not let this relationship be thought of principally in terms of defense, counterterrorism, intelligence, and so on and so forth. That's important. That will have its place. That is essential. But a lot of it is also, as you know, relatively speaking, under the radar. I mean, not just relatively speaking, even literally speaking, a lot of it is under the radar. So I think it's important that we also give some thought to some of the public manifestations and broader manifestations of this relationship. I think it's somewhat dismaying that we have only about 35,000 35,000 Israeli tourists coming to India every year, and about 40,000 Indian tourists going to Israel every year. Both those numbers could increase dramatically, but I would say with respect, it's the Israeli numbers that can increase even more, because Israelis are tireless travelers. And I would love to know how many go to Europe, how many go to America, and if you can give us 10, 15, 20% of that to India, we're in business. I think that's something that I'd like to see much more of. Secondly, trade and cooperation. Already we are seeing very interesting developments in joint research and development projects, Israeli companies, because Israel has fewer people than India. They're finding it useful to establish themselves here and hire Indians to work for them. All that's great. We're finding some interesting Indian FDI in Israel, with Indians buying Israeli companies in Israel and working there. I think this should be given massive encouragement. There should be much more discussion between the governments concerned of treaties that would provide incentives to business people in both countries to invest in each other's place and to also, oh my God, I'm late for Parliament, and also to try and develop and also to develop the relationship more closely. And then finally, and most important perhaps in this context, is the academic relationship. I think if we can have greater exchanges of scholars, if we can study more areas, get to know each other better, the sky would literally be the limit. We have the Prime Minister's visit looming to Israel. This is an unprecedented gesture. We had the President, in a sense, setting the precedent. And as I was saying to Ambassador Carmon, I think for this Prime Minister to undertake this visit at this time, after he has shored up his relationship with the Arab world and the Gulf countries, was the right order and the right way to do it. Many expected the order to be reversed, but that would have been a mistake because of India's dependence on Middle Eastern oil and the 6 to 7 million Indian workers in the Gulf countries whose position should not have been jeopardized. But having shored up the position of the Indian government in those areas, I think the Prime Minister can travel with confidence to Israel, feeling in many ways that what he is doing is something that speaks for India's independent foreign policy without in any way compromising its relations with anybody else. And I certainly hope that he travels with a bipartisan delegation of people from across the political spectrum to end the feeling that I joked to one of Danny's predecessors, ours is the love that dare not utter its name, because so much was being done quietly and so much was not acknowledged publicly. The Prime Minister's visit will finally be that public acknowledgement. So I just want to say once again, congratulations to all of you for assembling here for this conference. Thank you very much for inviting me to say a few words at the start. And I wish you all very successful, fruitful, and provocative and thoughtful deliberations in this conference. Thank you. Jai Hind.
Thank you, Dr. Tharoor, for those thought-provoking words and portraying the broad diplomatic and cultural history between India and Israel. I would like to acknowledge three very close friends of the center before I conclude the inaugural panel. First being Professor Kumaraswamy, Center for West Asian Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, who's written a landmark book on India's Israel policy. Professor Judith Greenberg, Rollins College, Florida, and Arjun Hardas, representative of American Jewish Committee, AJC API, Asia Pacific Institute of the American Jewish Committee, that has enabled a visiting scholars program at the center in JSIA. All the three scholars have contributed to the center's intellectual life, and we are very grateful for that. Jindal Center for Israel Studies would like to now thank the three panelists for their contribution to the conference, and it is customary in JGU to honor our guests with a memento and a university scarf. My apologies to Dr. Tharoor. We will definitely get innovative on that front, but thank you. Toda rabba. Thank you.